I was the woman behind the miraculous revival of a perfume brand thought to be dead. But one night in Milan, as I accepted an international award, I received a single email. "You've been demoted. Camille Aveline is now CEO. Camille, my cousin, who once owed me her entire life. No calls, no meetings, no goodbye. They erased my name from everything I built in silence as if I never existed. But I'm still here. And I'm not coming back for justice. I came back for everything. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next shocking stories from us." Before they erased my name from everything, I truly believed that in a family talent would be honored, not stolen. The scent of amber and bergamot still lingered in the folds of her silk blouse as Sienna Aveline stepped onto the marble stage, the applause hitting her like a wave she didn't brace for. Flashbulbs burst in synchrony. She didn't blink. She'd trained herself not to. Behind her, a massive screen pulsed with the logo of Maison Lumière, now one of the top 5 niche fragrance houses in Europe. A brand that 3 years ago was nothing but a forgotten attic full of broken glass and dusty lavender. She rebuilt it, bottle by bottle, story by story. The host, a French journalist from L'Année Moderne, beamed as he announced her name. And finally, the Visionary Artisan Award goes to Sienna Aveline for her reinvention of legacy, her fearless approach to scent memory, and her ability to turn silence into desire. She stepped forward in heels that echoed across the polished floor. Her custom white jumpsuit didn't scream for attention. It whispered authority. She accepted the plaque, a simple gold-rimmed circle mounted on a block of walnut. No speech, just a nod. She knew her scent spoke louder. Afterward, in the VIP gallery overlooking Milan's ancient plaza, she leaned on the stone balustrade with a flute of chilled Sancerre. The city below glittered, and inside guests were still murmuring her name. That's her Aveline, the one who saved Lumière. No one said Camille. Back in her hotel suite room, 913, minimalist in design but indulgent in linen, Sienna peeled off the award night persona like second skin. The plaque sat on the dresser, reflecting the soft light of the floor lamp. Her suitcase was still half open. She hadn't unpacked. She never did. Her world was transit, jet lag and jasmine, contracts signed over espresso, late-night sampling with producers in grass. She didn't have time for permanence. She sat at the edge of the bed, checking her phone. 5 unread messages, all from her assistant Beatrice, each more effusive than the last. "You crushed it. The industry's shaken." Camille posted a congratulations story weirdly. Camille. That name always arrived like an itch behind the eyes. Sienna exhaled, set the phone down, and reached for the folder she never left behind her sketchbook. Leather-bound corners worn soft by years of touch. Inside, aroma structures, oil blend formulas, texture timelines, even scent-linked emotion maps. No one saw it but her. Not even Camille, despite their bloodline. The knock came at 11:40 p.m. Room service, just her night tea. She thanked the boy in Italian, closed the door with her heel, and sat by the small desk. Rooibos and honey. She took a sip. Then her laptop pinged. One email. Subject line: leadership transition. Effective immediately. She froze. The mug hovered inches from her mouth. Her eyes scanned the screen once, then again. Her body didn't move. Not even a flinch. But her pulse was a drum roll. From Lumière Board of Directors to all departments. Internal only RE Executive Leadership Realignment. Maison Lumière is pleased to announce the appointment of Camille Aveline as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. Camille brings a fresh, modern approach to fragrance branding and has been instrumental in navigating our upcoming expansion into the wellness sector. We are confident in her vision. There was no mention of Sienna, not as outgoing CEO, not as founder, not as consultant, not even as family. The email had been sent at 7:42 p.m. She'd still been on stage then, still holding that walnut plaque, still smiling into the flash. She clicked back, refreshed, checked again. No follow-up, no personal message, no phone call, nothing. She didn't throw the laptop, she didn't scream, she just stared. The silence in the room congealed around her like resin. On instinct, she opened the Lumière website. The About Us tab had been updated. Camille's face photo, taken just 2 weeks ago at a corporate offsite, was now front and center. The paragraph below read like a manifesto of someone who hadn't touched a single pipette in her life. Words like synergy, emotional scenting, tech-integrated luxury. Sienna's name was gone. Not tucked lower, not footnoted, erased. The wall clock ticked. She didn't move for it. The Sancerre sat untouched. The hotel's air conditioning hummed oblivious to betrayal. She returned to the email, read the line again. Has been instrumental in navigating our upcoming expansion. Instrumental, the expansion into Southeast Asia was hers. The deal in Tokyo. She negotiated it during a typhoon with 3 hours' notice. The scent line adapted for humid climates, her innovation. And Camille? Camille had once asked whether sandalwood was grown in the south of France. Sienna blinked, once, slowly. At 6:30 the next morning, Milan still glowed in the warmth of early September haze. Sienna walked the lobby, suitcase in tow, her plaque tucked into her carry-on, her sketchbook pressed against her side like a rib. She paused before the brass doors, looked back once, not in nostalgia but in precision, burning the moment into memory. This was the second time she'd left without saying goodbye. The first time was the day she walked away from her inheritance at 22, refusing to inherit the failing Lumière label. Back then, the house was collapsing under debt and mildew. She chose exile. She chose to rebuild it her way. And she did. They'd begged her back at 30. She returned not for them, but for the craft, for scent, for her grandmother's voice whispering, "A good perfume doesn't shout, it stays." Now they erased her. This time she would not shout either, but she would stay, just not in the way they expected. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Not perfume, not the comforting sharpness of aldehydes or the resinous sweetness of ambergris. No, it was sterilized air, processed hollow as if someone had tried to scrub the history from the walls. Sienna stood at the glass doors of Maison Lumière's Paris headquarters, her posture composed, but hands trembling faintly beneath her gloves. The building looked the same from the outside, same brass handles, same beveled sign etched with the Lumière logo in serif gold. But as she reached into her bag for the access card she hadn't used in over a week, something told her the inside would not be. She swiped. A red flash. Access denied. She tried again, slower this time, as if gentleness could rewrite policy. Red again. Her reflection in the glass stared back, sharp cheekbones, tired eyes, the faintest crack in a woman usually made of stone. From behind the door, a receptionist noticed her. The girl knew maybe 6 months froze mid-sentence on a call. Their eyes met. The girl dropped her gaze, said nothing, did nothing. Sienna reached for the intercom button, pressed it once, then again. Nothing. She stepped back, looked up at the floors above rows of windows where she once paced during late-night brainstorms, where she'd signed off on packaging redesigns and approved scent launches under budget, under deadline, under pressure. Her kingdom, now sealed off like a museum where they'd quietly removed the name of the artist. No one came down. She didn't knock. By 9:30 a.m., she was seated in a nearby cafe on Rue Montorgueil, her laptop open, cappuccino cooling beside her. The croissant she ordered sat untouched, slowly losing its crispness. Wi-Fi connected. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. She typed the words slowly, du Maison Lumière d'Afar. The homepage loaded. New font, sleek, edgy. The landing image had been changed to a moody black and white of Camille standing in a sun-drenched greenhouse holding a bottle from the upcoming Regenesis line. The tagline, Rebirth Through Innovation. Sienna scrolled. Nowhere. Nowhere was her face, her name, her legacy. Not under our story, not under artisans, not in the archives. The timeline of the company's history skipped straight from the founding in 1923 to a vague renaissance in 2021, conveniently attributed to a new era of leadership. The scent collections were renamed. Silent Rain, her award-winning blend of blackcurrant violet leaf and smoked tea, now listed as reformulated for modern sensibilities, no mention of the perfumer behind it. She clicked on a press release dated 3 days prior. A statement from Camille. At Lumière, we believe in honoring tradition while stepping boldly into the future. Our new line reflects not only our values, but our evolution as a house led by innovation, intuition, and modern femininity. No credit, no footnotes, nothing. Sienna closed the laptop. The noise of the street returned, cutlery clinking, heels tapping, a toddler screaming somewhere nearby. Life went on. Her erasure was surgical, swift, public, and yet cloaked in civility. She didn't cry, but something inside her began to quiet. Not the kind of quiet that signaled defeat. No, this was something else. A gathering stillness, a drawing back before recoil. By 11:00 a.m., she was back in her old flat. The one she'd kept out of nostalgia, though she hadn't lived there since Lumière offered her the penthouse near the Seine. A place full of old books, faulty heating, and a bathtub too small to stretch in, but it had been her first refuge after college. And now, it was her exile. She slid the key into the lock. It resisted for a second, then gave. The inside smelled like dried eucalyptus and dust. Her landlord must have stopped by to air it out. A single ray of light cut through the blinds, striking the center of the wooden floor like a spotlight. She stood in it, still wearing her coat. No suitcase, no entourage, no plan. Just her. She dropped the bag on the floor and walked straight to the bookshelf, pulled out the second volume of Les Secrets d'Aînés, opened it, and from the hollowed pages withdrew a USB drive, inserted it into the side of her laptop. The screen lit up. A video file titled Internal Lumière Interview, Camille Aveline. She clicked play. It was a PR prep interview never meant for public eyes. Camille sat on a velvet chair posture, perfect legs crossed in a calculated triangle. A production assistant off-screen asked, "What would you say is your vision for Lumière now that you're CEO?" Camille smiled, gentle and disarming. "I think people crave more than nostalgia. They want relevance, clarity. My vision is to simplify our scent philosophy, make it more accessible. And yes, Sienna had her moment, but it's time for a different kind of story. Less about the artisan, more about the audience." Pause. "We're not erasing anyone. We're just updating the narrative." Sienna clicked pause, rewound, played it again. "We're not erasing anyone." "But you did." She unplugged the USB, tucked it back in the book, and walked to her desk. Opened the bottom drawer. There it was, the black leather-bound notebook. She hadn't touched it in months, not since the Singapore launch. Inside were pages of handwritten formulas, some scratched through, some bracketed in red ink. Oil ratios, temperature tolerances, titration notations. This was the heart of her craft. The invisible architecture behind the scents Camille now claimed as intuitive genius. She flipped to the middle. a section titled Regrowth Trials, Bloom Variations. She remembered the night she wrote it. 3 in the morning, jasmine absolute spilled on her wrist, migraine pounding behind her eyes, and the thought, what if a scent could mimic emotional recovery? She'd called it Velinora then, a made-up word, no meaning, just softness and intent. Camille had seen that page once, drunk on Chablis, said sounds pretty. I might use that for something one day. Sienna ran her finger across the ink. Velinora. They thought they'd buried her under their rebranding, scrubbed her from the homepage, denied her access, muted her memory. But the formula didn't live on a server. It lived here, on paper, in oil, and in her. The clock on the wall ticked once, and she smiled. Not wide, not victorious, but sharp. It was time to disappear, not in surrender, in preparation. The list started small, a single page, no formatting, no headers, just her handwriting, lean, angular, precise. Ink that bled slightly through the cheap notebook paper as if her fury refused to be contained. She didn't write it to mourn. She wrote it like a ledger, like a crime scene inventory. Stolen, heritage, 97, original blend, Whisper Bloom campaign, concept and tagline, Osaka launch strategy, final negotiation tactics, LVMH distributor contact, introduced in 2020, soundtrack licensing deal for the 2022 winter campaign, sourced via her former university classmate. Every line was a wound, but also a witness. Her memory didn't waver. That was the problem when you built something with your hands, you remembered everything. By 1500, the list had filled 3 pages. On the 4th page, she began a second list. Still loyal. It was shorter, but heavier. She thought of Matteo. He had worked quietly beside her for 5 years. A ghost in the lab coat. No press, no photo ops, just results. He knew oil like a surgeon knew flesh. She hadn't spoken to him since Camille took over, and he disappeared from the internal directory. Rumor said he refused to sign the new loyalty clause Camille insisted on, the one that required all artisan work to be released without attribution. Sienna didn't hesitate. She opened her phone, typed a number from memory. He answered on the 2nd ring. Matteo. A beat of silence. Then, "You finally calling to tell me you burned the place down?" "No," she said. "I'm calling to build something new." He didn't ask where, or when, or why now. Just said, "I'll bring the vetiver." At 16:30, she arrived at the storage facility Matteo now called his lab. It wasn't glamorous. Industrial walls, low ceilings, a perpetual smell of dried citrus peels and iron. But the glass shelves were spotless, and the table in the center bore the exact alignment of oils she'd once seen in their old office: neroli, labdanum, black pepper, the rare Bulgarian rose Matteo guarded like religion. He didn't offer tea. He didn't offer pity. He simply handed her a coat and said, "Pick your poison." She picked jasmine sambac. He raised an eyebrow. "Going straight for resurrection. I don't have time for the foreplay." By 17:30, the two of them stood over a glass mixing beaker, measuring and weighing, recalibrating. Sienna moved like someone with something to prove, but not to Matteo, to the silence, to the names who thought she wouldn't dare return. Velinora. The word lived in her notebook. But this would be its first breath. "What's the profile?" Matteo asked. "Restoration," she said. "Not revenge. I want something that smells like truth after a lie." Matteo nodded once. "We'll need oak moss, the real kind." He pulled a bottle from a locked drawer, unscrewed the top. The scent hit her like memory-damp forest floor. Old manuscripts, something sacred and stubborn. Her eyes watered, but she didn't blink. They worked through the night. 3 versions rejected, 1 accidentally overheated. At 2:00 a.m., they paused. Sienna leaned back on the cold counter. I remember when Camille asked if white musk came from real animals, she muttered. Matteo didn't laugh. She asked me once if bergamot was a type of cheese. They sat in silence, not comfortable, but shared. Then she stood, reached for the final vial, measured the base notes, tweaked the mid, whispered in the top layer of citrus barely a trace. The scent was quiet, but it held. By 3:40 a.m., they sealed the sample, poured it into a matte black bottle. No label, no flourish. Just truth. Matteo handed her a box. Charcoal leather lined with velvet, custom made from the days when packaging still mattered to her. Don't break it, he said soft. She placed the bottle inside, clicked the latch shut. For a moment she didn't move, just stared at it. Not in pride, not yet. Her reflection on the glossy black surface was unfamiliar. This woman had no softness left in her mouth, only resolve. Velinora was born that night not from ambition but from ash, from erasure. She didn't smile, but she no longer looked like someone grieving. She looked like someone who knew where the fire started and was now holding the match. The first person to respond was Clémence. A short text at 6:14 a.m. Whatever you're building, I'm in. No questions. No fanfare, no plea for position or title, just loyalty that had been waiting in the wings like a match waiting for breath. Within 24 hours, 5 more messages followed, all from people Sienna had once gone to war with under the Lumière banner, the ones who stayed late without being asked, who bled quietly into deadlines, who knew the difference between lavender from Grasse and lavender from Calabria by scent alone. They had been let go one by one over the past year. Camille's restructuring, cultural shift the board called it. In reality, it was purging anything that didn't mirror back her version of modern, luxury, sleek, sterile, and stripped of memory. But now memory was calling them home. Sienna didn't hold a recruitment meeting. She invited them to a rooftop, Thursday evening, overlooking the 6th arrondissement. The sun painted the buildings like butter on old bread. She brought no pitch deck, no product, no ego. Just a vial. She uncorked it and let the scent carry on the breeze. Velinora's prototype. Oak moss, neroli, a ghost of bergamot, and something else underneath. Like wet paper, like ink spilled on skin. When they inhaled, the reaction was instinctive. Eyes widened, shoulders relaxed. No one said a word. Then Clémence broke the silence. You wrote this for resurrection, she whispered. Sienna nodded. No, Clémence corrected. You wrote this to haunt. By 23:00, the lab was alive again. Not in the sleek, backlit, glass-walled way Camille had imagined in her corporate renderings, but in the way only artisans understood chaos with a pulse. Joël, the sourcing manager, who had once smuggled illegal Iranian galbanum through Belgium customs in a piano case, was back on the phone with his oldest vendors. Luc, who used to do scent mapping by intuition alone, was already sketching the olfactory architecture for a seasonal variant. They didn't need direction, they needed oxygen. Sienna gave them both, and while they worked, she sat in the corner with her notebook, drawing a single word again and again. Velinora. She didn't choose the name for beauty, she chose it for what it resembled in her mind. Vengeance. Elegance, legacy, inheritance. No permission, only return rising again, all of it hers. Velinora was no longer a placeholder in a sketchbook. It was a message, coded, soft on the tongue, hard in meaning. At 25 zuzurs, Camille stood before a press wall printed with the new Lumière logo, her hair ironed into submission, her face glowing under studio lights. The event Renaissance, a new era of Maison Lumière. Everything about it was curated. Guests holding champagne flutes etched with the Lumière DJs playing ambient cello remixes. Aromatic diffusers pushing out a modified scent labeled Bloom Reimagined. It was Sienna's formula. The original she wrote in a sleep-deprived haze in late 2021 after walking through the iris fields in Vaucluse. Back then, it didn't have a name, just a code BRX03. She'd written in her notes, too soft for war, maybe perfect for healing. She never released it. Camille did, under the name Hung Tai Sing, Rebirth Bloom, a Vietnamese-inspired naming direction, a calculated move for global markets. Camille had read it somewhere. Emerging Asian luxury markets favored poetic names. She smiled for the cameras, talked about creative vision, about modern leadership, about the power of scent to bridge trauma and growth. Each word came out like a soft knife. Sienna watched from the back of the room. No invitation, no seat, just a body in black near the technical crew. She blended into the wall, but the scent pulled her forward like a tether. She didn't interrupt. She didn't confront. She waited until Camille held the bottle aloft, frosted glass gold cap, minimal font, and then Sienna let herself breathe it in. It was hers, not just technically, emotionally. The balance was unmistakable. The push-pull between violet leaf and mimosa, the hesitation of vetiver in the dry down, the specific, almost imperceptible use of benzoin that warmed the finish like childhood memory. She closed her eyes. Someone behind her whispered, "It's stunning." Sienna opened her eyes. Camille was now walking down the aisle between rows of seated journalists, spritzing wrists, nodding with practiced grace. When she reached the front row, she leaned down to a Vogue editor and said low enough for most to miss, "We wanted something that felt born from real experience." Sienna almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she stepped quietly out. The side door, walked 2 blocks to where her driver waited, and slid into the back seat without a word. The engine hummed. Out the window, the press wall still glowed behind glass. She didn't look back. Her eyes were already forward. Velinora wasn't coming to compete. It was coming to claim. The ink on the certificate hadn't even dried before Sienna exhaled. It had been submitted in silence. No announcement, no press release, just a sealed envelope stamped, couriered, and tracked twice. One copy sent to the French Intellectual Property Office, the second sent to a private safe in Zurich under the Velinora holding account. Heritage 97, her firstborn blend, now legally hers again. She stared at the document, the confirmation of registration. Product classification 003, fragrance composition. Ownership Velinora Parfumerie Limited, authorized signatory Sienna Aveline. Not Camille, not Lumière. The formula had never existed digitally. It had lived in her sauté and nowhere else. The blend had only been used twice, once as a limited gift for a Japanese sommelier who had cried while smelling it, and once in a locked prototype never released. Camille hadn't recreated it, she'd stolen it. Sienna slid the certificate into a leather folio embossed with nothing. Just black, just weight. She left the apartment an hour later in a trench coat that didn't draw eyes. Her taxi cut through the 8th arrondissement traffic like a scalpel, stopping just outside a building that had once housed old money bankers. Now it was home to a different kind of power. Her mother's old friend, Eloise Morin, had converted the space into a boutique legal consultancy for creative professionals, artists, designers, inventors. The kind of firm that didn't advertise, that won cases before papers were filed. Eloise was waiting in a high-backed leather chair, a cup of black tea beside her glasses, resting low on her nose like a blade waiting to be drawn. "Sienna," she said without standing, "I was wondering when you'd finally call." Sienna sat across from her. No preamble, no soft entry. "They're using my formulas. They've deleted me from the record. I want to know what I can prove, and what I can take back." Eloise didn't blink. "Start with what you still have." Sienna opened the folio, pulled out 5 documents, 1 registered formula, 2 contracts with supplier attribution, 1 printout of an internal CRM screen showing her scent tagging structure now renamed under Camille's initiative, and 1 screenshot of Camille's latest LinkedIn post, proud to introduce Heritage Red, a scent of memory reborn. Eloise's lips curled. "She's brave." "She's sloppy," Sienna corrected. Eloise leaned back. Then let's begin. By 31 Hojo, they were neck-deep in paper trails. Eloise opened her laptop and began tracing signatures, legal ownership clauses, non-compete gaps. But it was the audio file that made her pause. It came from Beatrice, the former assistant, who had quietly passed it along with no comment. Just the file name, Camille Studio Rehearsal 2.4a. In the recording, Camille's voice was clear. She was rehearsing a media Q&A with a branding coach. What if they ask about the original formulas the coach asked? Camille, they won't. And if they do, I'll say the house owns the scent, not the nose. Coach, and if Sienna files something? Camille laughing Sienna. She won't. She doesn't know how to fight without crying. Eloise paused the audio. Is that enough for slander? No, Sienna said. But it's enough to fuel a fire. She reached into her bag, pulled out a printed email, internal confidential, forwarded from a sympathetic intern. The subject: legacy optimization timeline. In it, a bullet point plan for phasing out founder-centric messaging, refocusing all brand narrative around Camille's transformational leadership, and rebranding archived blends with gender-neutral proprietary code names. They hadn't just erased her. They'd reupholstered her history. At 3330, Sienna laid out the final page, her equity clause. Signed by her late grandfather, the original founder of Lumière, a clause most of the board had forgotten or pretended didn't exist. It clearly stated, in the event of a change in artistic or executive leadership, any proprietary blends not contractually waived remain the intellectual and moral property of the originating creator. It had been buried in footnotes, hidden under a file named Founders Legacy AG78.pdf. Forgotten, but not erased. Sienna tapped the clause with her index finger. Her nails were bare, unpainted. The moment didn't need polish. Eloise folded her hands. You don't want a courtroom. No, Sienna replied. I want context. Public. Not yet. She stood. Camille thinks I won't fight. She's right, I won't. Pause. I'll prove. At 34:00, Sienna returned to her apartment, sat at her desk, opened a new document. The cover read Velinora Provenance Dossier. Inside, scanned formulas, supplier emails, time-stamped drafts, comparative scent evaluations, copyright entries, and brand collateral she'd registered silently in the months prior. She reached for a pen, signed the bottom of the final page, then shut the folder with deliberate calm. The camera might as well have zoomed in then. On the gold-foiled phrase stamped into the lower right corner, no suit required, just proof of authorship. She stared at it for a beat. Let the silence fill the room like vapor. Then the screen faded to black and a single line appeared. You don't need to sue to win. You just have to remind them who was in the room when the story began. The Palais de Tokyo had never seen so many orchids in its life. At 3501, the atrium of Paris's most exclusive modern art museum had been transformed into what the invitations called a sensory rebirth. Custom lighting bathed the marble floor in soft rose gold, and from the high ceiling, thin gauze curtains cascaded like slow-motion rain. Every guest received a satin blindfold at check-in, Camille's way of inviting them to trust scent before sight. Trust, an ironic word. The house band, an all-female string quartet dressed in white, played a looping arrangement of Debussy's Clair de Lune. The scent of lilies, amber, and synthetic musk hovered in the air like a spell Lumiere's newest creation, Renaissance bloom. Camille stood behind the curtain, dressed in sculpted cream silk heels that clicked like punctuation marks against the polished floor. Her team bustled around her, makeup artist checking, last shine assistant whispering, media talking points, event manager counting down from 10. She adjusted the neckline of her dress. Perfect. Everything was perfect. At 36 Hosiery, the curtain lifted. Gasps filled the room, not just because of Camille, but because of what stood beside her, a display of crystalline perfume bottles suspended mid-air by invisible wires. They twirled gently, catching the light, each one bearing a delicate curve down the spine of the glass. Sienna's curve. An asymmetrical line she'd sketched 5 years ago in a journal. After seeing her grandmother's silhouette in candlelight, it was never released, never made public. The design had been filed, registered, locked. Now it floated, multiplied, praised. Camille stepped forward, smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice like satin, soaked in calculation. "Tonight, Maison Lumière enters a new chapter. A fragrance that speaks to healing power and unapologetic rebirth." Applause. At 3700, a commotion near the media pit. A woman in a gray pantsuit, discreet, exacting, leaned into a man wearing a lanyard marked Gold Tier Distributor, North America. She whispered something in his ear. He blinked, pulled out his phone and opened an image, zoomed in, stared at the bottle in the air, then again at his screen, then back at the bottle. He turned to his colleague, whispered, "She filed this 6 months ago." Under Velinora. The colleague's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "Positive. I signed the damn NDA." At 3800, 2 other attendees, all distributors, began murmuring. One of them turned to look over his shoulder. That's when he saw her. Sienna. No spotlight. No announcement. Just presence. She wore black, head to toe. No jewelry, no makeup. Her hair pulled back so severely it could cut glass. She wasn't there to be noticed. She was there to be undeniable. She didn't push forward, didn't interrupt. She walked calmly down the side aisle, heels silent on the carpet, passing a row of perfume bloggers who froze when they recognized her. At 3845, she reached the foot of the stage. Did not look at Camille, did not touch a mic, did not make a scene. She simply pulled a folded document from her coat pocket, walked to the lucite podium, and placed it there. 1 page, stamped, notarized, then turned. As she walked away, the cameraman closest to the stage instinctively zoomed in. The top of the paper read, "Certificate of Design Registration. Filed by Velinora Parfumerie Limited. January 3rd, 20XX. Design code 092L Heritage. Glassline designer Sienna Aveline. Status active." By 3900, the room had begun to splinter. A PR intern frantically tapped her earpiece, whispering, "She's here, she's here." Camille's breath caught, but she smiled harder, like if her teeth pressed together long enough, they might form armor. A journalist raised a hand. "Ms. Aveline, is she back with the company?" Camille hesitated. "She's attending as a guest." Another hand. "But the bottle design, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding." Behind her, her assistant stepped forward, whispering, "Do you want me to call legal?" Camille nodded, once sharp. Her smile didn't fade, but her fingers were trembling now slightly where they held the microphone. The applause never came back. At 4000, the music stopped mid-track. Unintentional. A cue missed. Or maybe not. Camille stepped off stage, pretending it was time for mingling. But inside, she felt the heat rising under her skin like acid reflux wrapped in silk. She reached backstage, grabbed her phone, scrolled to Sienna's number, tapped call. It rang once, twice, a third time, voicemail. No message left. She tried again, this time with shaking fingers. Nothing. At 4130, she leaned against the back wall, mascara smudging at the corners of her eyes. Her assistant hovered nearby, uncertain. "Do you want to postpone the second half of the presentation?" Camille didn't answer. She was staring at the stage like it had betrayed her. Like the ghost of the house she tried to steal from had returned to haunt her under lights she had dimmed on purpose. Sienna never answered the phone. She never needed to, because sometimes the loudest confrontation is presence. No quotes, no embellishment, just a black and white question centered in bold on the home page of Le Monde Style. Who really created Lumière? By 4205, it had already been picked up by 6 other outlets. The New Fragrance Review, The Scent Circle Vogue, Paris Online, Les Echos Business, L'Artisan Moderne and Bloom. The article beneath it was simple, surgical, and devastating. It outlined the registration history of the heritage glass line design, included screenshots of public trademark filings under the Velinora name, referenced the live on-stage moment where Camille had been handed a paper she never acknowledged, included archived quotes from Sienna's previous talks, once dismissed as niche artisan rants, now reframed as visionary foundation. But the sting came in one quote pulled from an internal email anonymously leaked dated 6 months prior. Once Sienna's out of the picture, we can rebrand without her shadow. The caption beneath it, shadow it seems still knows how to cast itself. By 44:00, the boardroom at Lumière's flagship office was full for the first time in months. Camille sat at the head of the long walnut table, flanked by 2 PR heads and the chief strategy officer who'd only joined last quarter. Her lipstick had faded. Her phone buzzed so often it looked like it vibrated of its own grief. Across from her, Sienna entered. Alone. No lawyer. No assistant. Just a black folder in her hand and something colder than confidence behind her eyes. No one spoke first. It wasn't silence. It was climate. Camille broke it. "We invited you today," she said carefully, "because things have gotten out of hand. The media's running with a narrative that's not complete." Sienna sat. "No," she replied. "They're finally completing the narrative you tried to fracture." A pause. Then Camille's father, Jacques Aveline, one of the company's 3 remaining original stakeholders, spoke. "We understand that emotions are high," he said, "but there must be a way forward that doesn't hurt the brand." Sienna opened her folder, pulled out 3 papers, laid them flat. "I'm not here to return," she said, voice even. "I'm not asking for a title. I'm not asking for back pay. I'm asking for one thing." Everyone leaned forward. Truth. At 46:00, she pointed to the first document, an affidavit verifying authorship of 10 key formulations used in the company's 3 most successful lines. The second was a licensing agreement retroactively applied under fair use based on her original development files. The third, a drafted public statement. It read in part, Maison Lumière acknowledges that the creative direction, initial formulations, and foundational product identity of its flagship collections were authored by Sienna Aveline during her tenure with the company. While the house continues to evolve under new leadership, it remains rooted in the visionary legacy that made its rebirth possible. It wasn't sentimental. It was factual. Necessary. Camille stared at the paper like it was a courtroom verdict. "This will damage the brand," she whispered. "No," Sienna said. "Lying damaged the brand. This starts to repair it." The board members read it. Whispered. Jacques looked between the 2 women, his hands folded, trembling. "She's right," he said. Camille turned to him, betrayed. "You're siding with her." "I'm siding with the truth," he replied. "You built a platform. She built a foundation. There's a difference." At 48:00, they signed. The Bien ban was initialed by every voting member of the board. A copy would be submitted to the press the next morning. Another posted on Lumière's official site under the Our Story tab, right where Sienna's name had been deleted 2 years ago. The room was still. Then Camille set her pen down, but she didn't speak. She just stared at the statement, her posture deflating, eyes no longer fixed, breath held too long. Sienna didn't smirk, didn't soften. She stood, gathered her folder, said only one thing before leaving. "You don't get to bury people and be surprised when they come back as roots." And then she walked out. No security escort, no music. Just quiet, the kind that always follows a reckoning. The letter arrived folded in quarters, wrapped in wax paper, and tied with the thinnest lavender thread. No return address, no sender's name on the envelope. Just her own in handwriting so old and familiar it made her stomach tighten before she even touched the paper. Sienna sat at her dining table, fingers resting on the cool ceramic of a teacup she hadn't sipped from yet. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with the unhurried rhythm of late afternoon rustling dry leaves like whispered memories. She untied the lavender string, opened the wax paper. Inside a single sheet of stationery, pale cream edges frayed with age. The ink was faded, but it held. The kind of writing that refused to disappear. It read, "My dear Sienna, I know the day will come when this house forgets what it owes you. Don't let them make you believe their silence is truth. You brought the flame back to Lumière. That's not branding. That's blood. Love, grand-mère." There was no date, but she knew exactly when it had been written back in 2017 after her first scent line tripled the company's revenue. Her grandmother, now long gone, had left the letter with the family's estate manager with instructions, "Only give this to her when she disappears." She had. And now the letter had found her. At 5100, Sienna drove east, just past the vineyards and into the valley where the Aveline family had once owned a modest estate, a stone house with blue shutters and a sloping field of jasmine her mother used to call the real inheritance. She hadn't stepped onto this land in over a decade. The house was smaller than she remembered. Time had that effect, shrinking the architecture of childhood into proportions that made nostalgia feel like exaggeration. The front door stuck when she pushed it, then gave with a dusty sigh. Inside, the air smelled like mothballs and eucalyptus. Old perfume boxes still lined the shelf in the back room, most unopened, some stained from leaky stoppers. She ran her finger along the top of one. Lumière No. 1, 1924. Created by her grandmother in the post-war years. They used to joke that the scent could make someone fall in love or surrender a country. Sienna walked through the kitchen, the tiles cracked and humming with silence, then through the small sunroom where her mother once dried petals by hand in cheesecloth under summer light. She reached the room, the one with the work table. It was still there, covered in a sheet slightly yellowed but untouched. She pulled it back slowly. Underneath, metal tools, wooden vials, glass flasks, her first laboratory. The place where her mother taught her to build scent by instinct, not formula. "Don't read the ratio," she used to say. "Read the memory." At 5300, the flashback arrived like a breath held too long. Sienna, age 9, hair tied in 2 loose braids, watching her mother crush dried fig leaves into a bowl with a mortar, adding 1 drop of orange flower water, the scent rising, soft green, nervous. "What does it remind you of?" her mother had asked. Sienna blinked, then whispered, "The day we visited the hospital, when you came out with a baby wrapped in white." Her mother had smiled, tears forming behind her eyes. "Yes, that's how you know it works." The memory cracked her chest open. She remembered now why she started. Not for elegance, not for legacy, but because she wanted to protect things no one else knew how to hold. She wanted to bottle memory, so it couldn't be stolen, so it wouldn't disappear. At 55 Sienna stood in the doorway of that little room, dust painting everything gold. Her fingers resting on the table's edge, her eyes soft but no longer clouded with rage. The anger had burned off like top notes. What remained was something else. Resolve. It didn't scream, it didn't shake. It hummed low and warm like bass notes deep in the skin. She stepped outside. The jasmine field was still there, though overgrown, wild, unruly. She didn't try to tame it. She walked through it slowly, deliberately, letting her hands brush the blossoms, letting the scent cling to her skin the way it had when she was small, when nothing had names yet, only feelings. There was no orchestra, no epiphany, no final monologue, just her and the air, and the quiet realization that what she had fought to protect wasn't just formula or design or recognition. It was this inheritance of scent, this language across generations, this promise from grandmother to granddaughter sealed in wax and lavender thread. Don't let them forget. Velinora didn't announce itself with a billboard or a flash. It arrived in a whisper. At 5601, an anonymous package was delivered to 25 of the most discerning perfumery boutiques across Europe. Each box contained a single bottle, matte obsidian, no logo, no instructions, just a handwritten card inside. For memory, not marketing. V. Most stores didn't even display it. They left it near the register unsold, unadvertised until someone curious picked it up and sprayed once, then again, then again. The reactions were quiet. One woman cried in Berlin, saying it reminded her of walking through her grandmother's garden in Tunis. A man in Madrid said he smelled something that made him think of childhood winters, even though he couldn't say why. In Kyoto, a journalist wrote on his blog, "It's like someone read my diary and bottled it." No tagline, no brand story, just resonance. The scent profile had no hero note. It didn't shout jasmine or demand tuberose. It unfolded, slowly, narrowly like the first page of a letter. Iris like hesitation. Amber and vetiver grounding it in a way that made people lean in instead of back. By 5800, word had spread without a single ad. Old clients began reaching out not to Velinora's public email, but directly to Sienna. They'd kept her contact saved all this time. Some didn't even ask if it was her brand. They already knew. One wrote, "I knew your hand was behind this. No one else builds silence like that." Another, "If you're ever shipping to Canada, we want first rights." Distributors, sommeliers, niche bloggers, even a retired Japanese calligrapher who had once requested a scent commission before Sienna was pushed out. They didn't care about who ran Lumière now. They cared about what they trusted. Sienna replied to none of them directly. Instead, she prepared her second batch. The next bottles had a label still simple, still clean. Just one word in calligraphic gray Velinora. No last name, no founder's story on the box. Because the scent didn't need a biography. At €60 less cents, the most respected fragrance publication in Europe dropped an editorial titled, "You can change the CEO but not the scent of memory." The piece was piercing. It traced the olfactory lineage of Lumière's greatest hits, charting how certain notes now erased from official branding could be found again in Velinora's debut line. The article didn't name Sienna. It didn't have to. It ended with, "Velinora proves something vital: memory doesn't need permission to survive. It just needs an opening." Within 24 hours, the article was translated into 5 languages and shared across every industry circle. The stock of Velinora's first run sold out before the week ended. At 62:30, a courier knocked on Sienna's door. He held a single envelope cream sealed with gold wax. She signed for it, closed the door, and set it on the kitchen counter. She didn't open it right away. She already recognized Camille's handwriting, that looping practiced cursive equal parts elegance and apology. When she finally opened it that night, there was no formality. Just a few short lines. "I was wrong. I thought vision was about being louder. But I see now it's about seeing further. You saw it all before I did. I'm sorry." There was no signature, no return request, just the letter folded once. Sienna read it once, then again, then slid it back into the envelope and placed it inside her desk drawer between the first formula she ever wrote and the certificate of design registration for Heritage 97. She didn't reply, not because she was still angry, because some things didn't need to be answered. They just needed to be remembered. At 6301, the marble halls of the Grand Palais were flooded with flashes of light silk hems brushing against velvet staircases, and the perfume of anticipation, the kind that clings to skin more than air. It was the final night of Paris Fashion Week, and the runway belonged to no one designer, but many. A curated collaborative show from the most daring houses across Europe. But the real conversation wasn't about the clothes. It was about the scent, a smell unlike anything else that week, unbranded, unnamed, and yet unmistakable. It drifted through the crowd, woven between spotlights and backstage whispers. Whispers that all asked the same thing: who made this? There were no logos, no press kits, just a few gloved attendants who carried small black atomizers in their pockets and misted the venue's velvet curtains every hour per instructions. Only one clue had been left behind: a linen card slipped into every front row gift bag. Embossed in gray ink, it read, "Velinora, for those who remember what was never spoken." No name followed, but the world already knew. By 65 Sienna found herself seated on stage at a public forum titled "Sent in Memory, the Invisible Archive." The invitation had come months ago, before Velinora's quiet uprising. She nearly declined. She didn't like microphones, and she'd promised herself no more panels. But something told her this one was different. She sat beside a neuroscientist, a novelist, and a museum curator. When her turn came, she didn't speak of betrayal or erasure. She didn't mention Camille or courtrooms. She simply said, "I started working with scent because I didn't want to forget. I didn't have the language to talk about grief, or longing, or change. But scent remembers for you. It doesn't ask permission, it just stays." The room held its breath. She didn't fill it. She let the silence say the rest. At 67 after the panel, while people mingled and moved on, Sienna stood in the hallway of the venue, a quiet gallery space filled with handwritten labels, glass cloches, and raw scent ingredients for guests to explore. A girl no older than 17 approached her. Her apron smelled of dried citrus and nervous ambition. She held a journal clutched tight against her chest. "Madame Aveline," she said, breath catching. Sienna turned, expecting another journalist, another pitch, another card. But the girl's voice cracked sincere. I want to make sense like you used to, when you still wrote by hand." There was no tremble in Sienna's smile, no cynicism. She nodded once. "What do you smell like when you're sad?" she asked the girl. The question landed like a puzzle. The girl paused, startled, then whispered, "Like when it rains, but only on the left side of the street." Sienna's eyebrows lifted. That was the right answer, not because it made sense, but because it was felt. At 69 she reached into her bag and pulled out a thin notebook. Hand-stitched. Cream pages unmarked. No logo. She held it out. "This is for you," she said softly. "And don't ever let anyone else write in it for you, not even me." The girl took it with both hands, mouth open, eyes wide. And Sienna, for the first time in a long time, saw her own beginning not in a mirror, but in another. By 69:30, as she walked away, her footsteps echoed lightly in the gallery. Not loud, not rushed, but certain. A queen without a crown, building her empire from roots and memory, one quiet revival at a time. At 70:01, Sienna stood alone on the quiet hill just outside Grasse. Not the glamorous hills of Monaco, not the gilded balconies of Paris, but here where she had once sat as a teenager with a sketch pad in one hand and a broken vial of bergamot oil in the other, dreaming of a scent that could carry a name across generations. The grass bent gently beneath her, heavy with morning dew. She sat down, fingers trembling slightly, not with fear, but finality. In her palm, the first bottle of Velinora, matte black, smooth to the touch like river stone. Her initials weren't on it. Her signature wasn't engraved. But every note inside was hers. At 71:30, she unscrewed the cap. A single drop to the inside of her wrist. It hit her like memory does, sudden, scentless for the first second and then violently alive. Not nostalgia, recognition. The scent bloomed into something she had never worn before but always carried inside a thread of lavender for her mother, white musk from the linens of her childhood, and a ghost note of bitter almond, her grandfather's last cologne long since discontinued. She smiled, not the kind that invites a camera, the kind that tastes like truth. By 73 a montage unfolded, a world silently waking up to Velinora. A woman in Sao Paulo lifting her scarf to breathe deeper after a single spray. A couple in Kyoto trading bottles like handwritten letters. A child in Accra burying her nose into her mother's blouse, whispering, "It smells like love." Velinora wasn't a trend. It wasn't a comeback. It was an undercurrent. The next scene cut to a rooftop in Berlin. A sleek black sign being hoisted up by cranes Velinora in serif font quiet and clean. Below it, workers unboxed crates labeled "From Grass with Memory." No PR stunt, no champagne fountains, just permanence. At 75 under, the screen slowly faded into Sienna's voice, now steady, certain like someone who no longer needed to scream to be heard. Legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you defend even when the people you call family ask you to forget it, even when they erase your name, even when the thing you built is handed to someone else with a smile and a contract. Memory doesn't need their permission, neither do you. Silence followed. No music, just breath, just wind. At 76:30, the screen turned black. One final line appeared in white serif letters, Velinora, rooted in memory, not permission. And then nothing. No logo, no fade out. Just a story that didn't need an ending because it had already become something else. A beginning.